The Beatles came in a week of suffocating stillness, a week when the sun baked the iron-hard ruts of the road into pottery, and the creek dwindled to a series of stagnant, muddy eyes. At first, it was a sound, a low, collective hum on the eastern horizon, a sound you felt in the bones of your jaw before you heard it with your ears. Then, a smear of greasy smoke against the cerulean sky. It was not smoke. The men who had seen locust plagues in Kansas and grasshopper swarms in the Dakotas knew the look of it. It was a living cloud, and it was coming for the valley's brief, hard-won green. They descended not with the roar of a storm, but with a million tiny clicks, a sound like dry seeds being poured onto a tin roof. They covered everything. Within an hour, Silas Croft's prized tomato vines, the talk of the county, were naked stalks weeping clear fluid in the heat. Martha Gable's pole beans, which she trained up the side of her white-painted house, were gone, leaving behind a fretwork of lace-like leaves that crumbled to dust at a touch. The cornfields, just beginning to tassel, were stripped to pale, pathetic skeletons. The valley, which had been a patchwork of dusty browns and hopeful greens, turned a uniform, defeated tan. Despair settled like the dust, thick and choking. But at the far end of the valley, on the 20 acres of rocky, worthless land that everyone had advised Eliza Vance against buying, there was a patch of defiant, miraculous green. Her garden was an island. The men and women of the town, their own gardens reduced to ruin, walked the half-mile to her fence line and simply stared. They saw rows of cabbages, their heads tight and heavy. They saw summer squash with hides of glossy yellow and deep green. They saw tomato plants, heavy with fruit, their leaves untouched. And moving among the rows, making a soft, contented burbling, was the source of the miracle, her birds. 150 of them, small and brown and plump, pecking and scratching, devouring every beetle that dared cross the perimeter. The town stood at the fence in stunned silence, watching the thing they had mocked become the one thing that had worked. And they watched Eliza, the foolish woman alone, move among her flock, her face calm, her hands steady, the sole proprietor of the last green thing in a brown and broken world. 6 months earlier, no one would have believed it. 6 months earlier, Eliza Vance had arrived with a single sturdy trunk, a small inheritance that was mostly grit, and the deed to the sorriest piece of land in the county. It was the old Miller place, a patch of ground so riddled with stones and clay that old man Miller himself had said you couldn't even raise a decent crop of weeds on it. The house was a 2-room shack with a leaky roof and a floor that tilted to the west. Its only redeeming feature was a deep, stone-lined root cellar, cool and dark and smelling of damp earth and forgotten winters. The town of Providence, which prided itself on a certain blunt frontier charity, gave her a week of pity and then settled into a low murmur of skeptical judgment. A woman alone? Silas Croft had said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near the wheel of her cart. On the Miller place? She'd have done better to sleep in the street. Mr. Gable, the grain dealer and unofficial town patriarch, had been more polished in his condescension. He'd tipped his hat, his face a mask of false concern. My dear Miss Vance, this is no place for a woman of your delicate constitution. The land is unforgiving. Perhaps a position as a governess in my own home would be more suitable. He had 3 rowdy sons and a wife who looked perpetually exhausted. Eliza had met his gaze, her own clear and steady. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Gable, but I mean to work the land. A ripple of amusement had gone through the men gathered at the general store. Work the land. The Miller place. The joke was too good. She spent the first month doing nothing but hauling rocks. She pulled them from the half-acre she'd designated as her garden plot, her hands, once a teacher's hands, blistering and then healing into a tough, calloused hide. She used the rocks to shore up the foundation of the shack and to build a low wall around her plot. The town watched. They saw her rise before the sun and work until the light failed. They saw her grow thinner, her face dusted with dirt, her dress patched at the knees. They saw it as a kind of slow, inevitable starvation. What they didn't see was the thinking. They didn't see her crumble the soil in her hands, noting how, beneath the hardpan clay, there was a darker, richer loam. They didn't see her watch the flow of the meager spring, calculating how to dig channels to make the most of every drop. And they certainly didn't see the reason for her madness when she returned from a 2-day trip to the railhead with 3 wooden crates that peeped. The crates held 200 fertile quail eggs, nestled in wood shavings. They were small and delicate, a soft cream color speckled with patterns of dark brown and gray, like miniature river stones. When she carried them into the general store to buy kerosene for her lamps, Silas Croft had guffawed. "What in tarnation are those?" "Sparrow eggs." Eliza ignored him, her focus on the careful arithmetic in her head. "I need 20 gallons of kerosene," she told the storekeeper, her voice even. The storekeeper looked at Mr. Gable, who was leaning against the counter. Gable picked up one of the eggs, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a curious insect. "Quail," he said, a note of final, damning judgment in his voice. "The things are practically wild. All flight and no meat. What do you plan to do with these, Miss Vance?" "Hatch them for a flock of sparrows." "I plan to hatch them," she said simply, placing her money on the counter. "And then they will work for me." The laughter that followed her out of the store was not cruel, not yet. It was the easy, thoughtless laughter of people who believed they knew the world and its limits. It was the laughter of people who saw a woman alone trying to wring life from a stone and could only imagine one outcome. That night, in the cool, silent dark of the root cellar, Eliza set up her improbable nursery. She had lined the stone shelves with straw and blankets. She placed the lamps at careful intervals, trimming the wicks until they burned with a low, steady, smokeless heat. She laid the eggs in neat rows, 100 per shelf. The arithmetic of survival filled the quiet space. Each lamp burned a pint of kerosene a day. 20 gallons would last her the 25 days she needed for incubation and the first week of life. If the hatch rate was even 50%, she would have 100 birds. If half of those survived to maturity, she would have 50. 50 birds. It was not a flock. It was a prayer. Her only neighbor, a reclusive Danish widower named Sorensen who lived a mile down the creek, came by the next day. He was a man carved from old wood, his face a map of sun and wind. He had watched her haul rocks without a word. Now he stood at the edge of her plot, his eyes taking in the low stone wall, the newly turned earth. He did not laugh. "The land speaks 2 languages," he said, his voice a low rumble, accented and gentle. "The one for the fool, who shouts at it and demands. And the one for the listener, who kneels and learns." He peered into her shack, then at the cellar door. "What do you hear?" For the first time since arriving, Eliza felt a crack in her solitary resolve. She showed him. She led him down the stone steps into the warm, lamp-lit dark, into the smell of straw and kerosene and hope. He walked the length of the shelves, his rough farmer's hand hovering over the eggs. He touched one, a brief, reverent gesture. He looked at the lamps, at the buckets of water she'd placed in the corners for humidity. He nodded, a slow, deep affirmation. "Ja," he said. "Patience. This is good work. Hard work. But good." He showed her how to turn the eggs, a quarter turn, 4 times a day, to keep the embryo from sticking to the shell. He explained that the cellar's consistent coolness at its edges and the lamp's heat in its center created a convection that would circulate the air. He called it earth-breathing. He did not ask her what she planned to do with them. He simply accepted that she had a plan. His belief was a small, warm coal she banked deep inside her. For the next 3 weeks, the root cellar became the center of her universe. 4 times a day, she descended into the lamplit warmth to turn the eggs. She marked each one with a small pencil X so she would know its position. The work was methodical, repetitive, a kind of rosary counted in speckled shells. Above ground, she worked her garden. She had amended the soil with leaf mold she'd gathered from the wooded creek bed and manure Mr. Sorensen had given her from his single dairy cow. She planted what the seed packets called sturdy and reliable varieties. Cabbages that could withstand a late frost, squash that grew with abandon, tomatoes bred for determination rather than delicate flavor. The town's mockery had subsided into a kind of pitying silence. They saw her as a lost cause, a piece of sad, stubborn theater playing itself out on the edge of town. They had their own work to do, their own fields to plow and plant in the traditional, sensible way. Eliza's small, strange farm was a footnote, a cautionary tale whispered among the women. "Poor thing," they'd say, shaking their heads. Her mind must have snapped from grief. On the 17th day, a change occurred. Tapping one of the eggs, she felt a faint, impossibly tiny vibration from within. She held it to her ear and heard a minuscule scratching. Life. The sound was so quiet, so secret, it felt like a sin to even acknowledge it. By the 23rd day, the cellar was filled with a faint, constant rustling. On the morning of the 24th day, she found the first pip, a tiny star-shaped crack in a shell, from which a wet, dark beak protruded, working silently. By evening, a dozen were out, wet, exhausted, and no bigger than her thumb. They were dark, downy things with enormous eyes, all instinct and vulnerability. The next morning, the cellar was no longer silent. It was filled with a high, insistent peeping, a sound of such vibrant, multitudinous life that it brought tears to her eyes. The shelves were a writhing mass of tiny, newly hatched quail. She counted them as she moved them to the brooder boxes she had built, lined with soft rags. 162. An 81% hatch rate. The arithmetic had been too cautious. She had not dared to hope for such abundance. It had worked. The first part of her gamble had paid off. The joy was fierce and private, a secret she hugged to herself in the dark. She told no one, not even Mr. Sorensen. This victory was hers alone. The town saw nothing. They saw her buy more feed than a woman with no chickens should need. They saw her spend her evenings by lamplight, not reading, but mending a fine-meshed net. They shook their heads and waited for the inevitable failure. It was during this time that the boy appeared. His name was Leo, one of Gable's 3 sons, a boy of 12 with watchful eyes and a habit of lingering at the edges of things. While his brothers were loud and boastful like their father, Leo was quiet and observant. He started appearing at her fence line, not to mock, but to watch. He watched her weed. He watched her carry water from the creek. One day, she looked up and saw him staring at the netting she was stretching over the low stone wall. "What's that for?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eliza straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow. "To keep things in," she said. "And to keep other things out," he considered this. "Hawks, hawks," she agreed. He was silent for a long time. Then, "Can I help?" The other boys would have laughed. They would have thrown rocks. But Leo's curiosity was genuine, a thirst for purpose in a town that offered a boy like him little but chores and expectations he didn't fit. "You can help me finish this netting," she said. "If you're quiet. You mustn't startle them." He nodded, his expression serious. He worked with a surprising dexterity, his small fingers quick and sure. When they were finished, she led him to the cellar door and opened it. The wave of sound, the peeping of over 100 young birds, washed over them. Leo's eyes went wide. He crept down the steps behind her, moving as if in a cathedral. He stared at the brooder boxes, at the tiny birds tumbling over each other. "You did it," he breathed, a look of pure wonder on his face. "Everyone said you were crazy. Sometimes it's wise to be what everyone calls crazy," Eliza said, sprinkling feed for the birds. From that day on, Leo was her shadow. He came after his chores were done, his pockets full of grasshoppers and crickets for the growing birds. He learned to clean the pens, to fill the waterers, to spot a bird that was off its feed. He didn't talk much, but he listened. He listened to the birds, and he listened to Eliza. He was the first citizen of her new, small nation. By June, the quail were nearly grown. They were no longer downy chicks but sleek, brown and gray birds, the size of a man's fist. Eliza and Leo moved them from the cellar into the garden, which was now enclosed by the stone wall and the netting overhead, a secure, open-air pen. The town's amusement began to curdle into suspicion. Wagons didn't just appear at a failed farm. And Eliza's farm, stubbornly, was not failing. Her garden was thriving. The quail, it turned out, were meticulous workers. They scratched and aerated the soil. They ate weed seeds and insect pests with a relentless appetite. Their droppings were a nitrogen-rich fertilizer that made the cabbages swell and the squash vines race across the ground. It was a closed, perfect system, an engine fueled by sun, water, and the tireless industry of her flock. And they began to lay. The eggs were small, of course, but they were plentiful. Every morning, Eliza and Leo would collect basket after basket of the beautiful, speckled treasures. Soon, she had more than she could ever eat, more than she could preserve. She had a surplus. A thing's only worth what others will pay for it, the town wisdom went. And no one in Providence wanted to pay for a handful of tiny, strange eggs, when a single chicken egg was 3 times the size. Mr. Gable was the first to try to profit from her perceived failure. He arrived one afternoon in his polished buggy, a picture of magnanimous authority. "Miss Vance," he began, not even bothering to get down. "I hear you have a glut of those little eggs." "A foolish venture, as I predicted, but no matter. As a gesture of goodwill, I'll take them off your hands. A penny for a dozen. It's more than they're worth, but I can't bear to see you suffer a total loss." Eliza looked at the basket in her hand, full of perfect, fresh eggs. She looked at Gable's smug, fleshy face. She thought of the kerosene, the sleepless nights, the patient turning. "No, thank you, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have other plans for them." His face tightened. The mask of false charity slipped, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Don't be a fool, woman. No one will buy them. You'll be feeding them to the hogs. If you had any, I don't," she said. "And I won't." She turned and walked back to her shack, leaving him sputtering in his buggy. The encounter sharpened her resolve. Providence was a prison of low expectations. If she wanted a fair price, she would have to find a different market. The next week, she packed 3 large crates with hundreds of eggs, cushioned in straw. She paid a boy with a sturdy wagon to take her and her cargo to the city, a full day's journey east. Leo, his face a storm of worry, watched her go. "What if they say no?" he asked. "Then we'll have eggs for breakfast for a year," she said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The city was a cacophony of noise and smells, a world away from the dusty quiet of Providence. Eliza, guided by a tip from Mr. Sorensen, found her way to the city's finest hotel, a grand brick building with a uniformed doorman. She asked for the chef. She was made to wait in a hot, clattering kitchen, a small, plain woman in a calico dress, holding a basket of quail eggs. Finally, a tall, impossibly clean man in a starched white hat emerged from a cloud of steam. He had a fierce mustache and weary, skeptical eyes. This was Chef Antoine. "What is this?" he asked, his French accent thick with impatience. Eliza didn't say a word. She took one of her eggs, cracked it with her thumbnail, and dropped the perfect, jewel-like yolk and white into a small saucer she had brought. The chef's eyes narrowed. He picked up the saucer. He sniffed it. He dipped the tip of his little finger into the yolk and tasted it. His expression changed. The skepticism melted, replaced by a flicker of interest, then recognition. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "I hatched them," she said. He took another egg, then another. He cracked them, examining the color of the yolk, the firmness of the white. He fired a small pan, melted a knob of butter, and cooked 3 of the eggs in less than a minute. He ate them in a single bite, his eyes closed in concentration. He chewed slowly. Then he opened his eyes, and they were no longer weary. They were alight. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. "How many can you bring me?" "Every week." They settled on a price that made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. It was more than 10 times what Gable had offered. It was enough to buy kerosene for a year. It was enough to buy lumber and seed and new boots. It was enough. She walked out of that hotel not as a foolish woman with a failed experiment, but as a producer, a businesswoman with a standing order and a wealthy client. The wagon ride home was silent. The world looked the same, but Eliza knew it was fundamentally different. She had found a crack in the wall of what was possible, and she had pushed her way through. The weekly trips to the city changed everything, though Eliza worked hard to ensure that, on the surface, nothing changed at all. The town saw the same wagon arriving at her gate every Tuesday morning and leaving with crates, but they couldn't imagine the value of the contents. They assumed she was selling at a pittance, stubbornly refusing to admit defeat. "She's selling them for chicken feed," Silas Croft declared at the general store, and everyone nodded. It was a comfortable explanation. It kept the world in its proper order. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The money, however, was real. It arrived in crisp bank notes that Eliza kept in a locked tin box under a loose floorboard. With it, she did not buy luxuries. She bought necessities, and she bought time. She bought better feed for her birds, a mix of grains and minerals that made their feathers gleam and their eggs richer. She bought lumber, and she and Leo spent the long evenings of early summer building new, more spacious shelters for the quail within the garden enclosure. Leo was changing, too. The quiet, watchful boy was becoming a quiet, capable young man. He had a way with the birds, a gentle touch that calmed them. He started calling them by name, a flock of 150 individuals, each with a personality he knew. There was Pip, the first to hatch, General, a feisty cockbird who strutted and preened, and Shadow, a shy hen who laid her eggs in the same hidden spot every day. Eliza found the habit gently absurd, but she never discouraged it. The boy who had been an outsider in his own family had found his flock. He was no longer just helping. He was taking ownership. One afternoon, Mr. Gable's buggy appeared at the end of her lane again. This time, he was not alone. His wife, Martha, sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Gable watched as the city wagon was loaded with its crates. His eyes, which had once held only condescending pity, now held a glint of sharp, covetous curiosity. "Miss Vance," he called out, his voice oozing a false warmth. "It seems your little hobby is keeping you busy. It's a business, Mr. Gable," Eliza replied calmly, securing the last crate. "And yes, it keeps me busy, a business," he repeated, tasting the word. "I confess, I'm surprised. There's no market for such things around here. The world is bigger than Providence." Mr. Gable, his smile, didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. So big, in fact, that a woman alone might find it difficult to manage. Contracts, shipping, and scrupulous city buyers. It's a great deal to handle. Perhaps you would be interested in a partner? Someone with experience in commerce. To protect your interests," he meant. She knew that he wanted to take it from her. He wanted to insert himself between her and her success, to control the flow of money and power. He saw her as a resource to be exploited, no different from a field of wheat or a vein of coal. "My interests are well protected," she said. "Leo and I manage just fine." She gestured to the boy, who stood straighter, his hand resting on a crate. For the first time, Gable looked at his own son as if he were a stranger. The sight of the boy, so clearly allied with this woman, so clearly thriving outside of his father's orbit, seemed to anger him more than her refusal. He snapped the reins, and the buggy pulled away in a cloud of dust. But the encounter left Eliza with a new unease. She had seen the shift in his eyes from mockery to envy. Envy was a more dangerous thing. It was an act of hunger. It wanted to possess, and what it could not possess, it often sought to destroy. That evening, Mr. Sorensen stopped by. He did not mention the Gables. He pointed his chin toward the sky, which was a brassy, cloudless bowl. "The ground is thirsty," he said, his old country accent making the words sound like a pronouncement. "Thirsty ground invites hungry guests." He looked at her Quail, scratching contentedly among the squash vines. He nodded. "You have good soldiers. I hope they are enough." Eliza didn't understand then. She thought he was talking about hawks or foxes. She did not yet know the language of true hunger, the kind that travels on a million wings. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down from a sky the color of bleached linen. The creek slowed to a trickle, then to a string of stagnant pools. The earth cracked, the fissures running like dark veins through the fields. And then, the sound began. A low, pervasive hum that vibrated in the air, a prelude to the coming devastation. The beetle swarm blotted out the late afternoon sun. It wasn't a flock or a cloud. It was a blanket, a living, clicking, crawling entity that descended upon the valley. They were Colorado potato beetles, but they were not picky. They landed on the carefully tended gardens of Providence and began to feast. The sound of their chewing was a horrifying, collective rasp. They stripped tomato plants bare in minutes, leaving behind only the skeletal frames of the wire cages. They devoured the broad leaves of the squash and cucumber vines, leaving a tangled mess of naked stems. They marched through the bean rows and the cornfields, a relentless, armored army. Panic spread through the town. People ran from their houses with brooms and blankets, trying to beat them back, to cover their precious plants. It was useless. For every 100 they crushed, 1,000 more took their place. The air filled with the stench of the beetles' acrid defense spray and the sharper, cleaner scent of crushed tomato leaves, the smell of a summer's work being annihilated. From her own fence line, Eliza watched the brown tide roll toward her. For a moment, her heart seized with the same cold dread that was gripping the rest of the town. She had built a fortress of netting and stone, but it was a fortress against hawks and foxes, not against an invading army of this scale. She saw the first wave of beetles reach her stone wall. They crawled over it, a shimmering, striped cascade. They dropped into her garden. And then, a new sound joined the terrible hum and click. It was a burble of intense, focused excitement. Her quail, which had been dusting themselves in the late afternoon sun, suddenly came alive. They surged forward, not in panic, but with purpose. They met the invading wave of beetles with a voraciousness that bordered on glee. They were built for this. Their beaks, too small for large grains, were perfect instruments for plucking beetles from leaves and snapping them up. They pecked and swallowed, their heads darting with incredible speed. They didn't just eat the beetles, they hunted them. They chased them down, snatching them from the undersides of cabbage leaves, from the stems of the tomatoes, from the soil itself. Leo, who had run to the garden at the first sign of the swarm, stood frozen in the middle of it all, a look of awe on his face. The beetles were pouring into the garden, but they were not getting past the first few rows. The quail were a living, feathered line of defense, a mobile, self-propelled, and utterly effective pest control system. What had been a slow, methodical engine of soil aeration and fertilization had instantly transformed into an elite battalion of insect destroyers. Eliza walked slowly into the heart of her garden. The air outside the netting was thick with the swarm. Inside, it was a scene of controlled, productive chaos. The quail, her ridiculous, undersized, and unprofitable birds, were saving everything. They were not just surviving the plague, they were feasting on it. By dusk, the main body of the swarm had passed, moving west, leaving a trail of complete destruction in its wake. Every garden in Providence, save one, was gone. The silence that fell was more profound than the noise that had preceded it. It was the silence of utter defeat. The next morning, the town woke up to a changed world. The vibrant greens of yesterday were gone, replaced by a uniform vista of brown and gray. The smell of decay hung in the hot, still air. One by one, and then in small, silent groups, the people of Providence made their way to Eliza's land. They didn't come to mock or to pity. They came as pilgrims to a miracle. They stood at her fence, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief, and stared. Inside the netting, Eliza's garden was an impossible oasis. The cabbages were whole, the tomatoes hung heavy and red on the vine, the squash plants were lush and green. And moving among them, fat and content, were the quail. They were the heroes of the hour, the saviors of the crop, the ridiculous birds that had turned out to be the wisest investment in the valley. Silas Croft, the man who had laughed at her sparrow eggs, stood staring at his own ruined tomato patch, then at hers, his face a mask of stunned comprehension. Martha Gable, whose prize-winning beans were now just strings on a wall, clutched a handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding of what they had lost and what Eliza had preserved. Being right is its own kind of reply. Eliza felt no triumph, only a deep, quiet affirmation. She had listened to the land, as Mr. Sorensen had advised. She had seen the value where others saw none. She had trusted the quiet economy of small things. But her peace was short-lived. A familiar buggy rattled down the lane, moving with an urgency that set her teeth on edge. Mr. Gable pulled up, his face flushed, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light. He saw not a miracle, but an opportunity. He strode to her gate, his boots kicking up dust. "A tragedy," he said, gesturing to the devastated valley. "A complete tragedy. The town will starve this winter if something isn't done." He wasn't looking at the valley. He was looking at her garden. "You, on the other hand, have been blessed with a miracle." "It wasn't a miracle, Mr. Gable," Eliza said, her voice even. "It was work. And foresight, of course," he said dismissively. "But the point remains. You have food. The town has none. You have a civic and a moral duty to share what you have." "I have always intended to share it," she said. "At a fair price." Gable's face hardened. "There's no time for that. This is an emergency. The town council, of which I am the head, is prepared to declare your property a public asset. We will inventory your stock and distribute it according to need. We will, of course, compensate you for your input." He meant he would seize it. He would use the town's desperation as a weapon to take what he had been unable to acquire through cunning. He would be the hero, distributing her hard-won bounty, and she would be left with a handful of worthless IOUs. "My input," she said, her voice dropping, is 152 birds, to be precise. And 87 tomato plants. How did you know I had so many? It was a shot in the dark, a slip he'd made in a previous conversation, a detail he couldn't have known unless he'd been spying, counting, assessing her value for his own purposes. A flicker of guilt, quickly suppressed, crossed his face. It's a figure of speech, it was not. He had been watching. He had been counting. He saw her not as a neighbor, but as an asset on a ledger. "This is my land, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice ringing with a new authority. "This is my garden. And these are my birds. They are not a public asset. You will not be seizing anything." His face turned purple. "You cannot stand against the whole town, Miss Vance. A lone woman. They are hungry. They will listen to me." "We'll see about that," she said, and for the first time, she did not feel like a lone woman at all. She felt like the keeper of the last green place on earth, and she would not see it plundered. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the easy courtesies and exposes the bedrock of character beneath. In the days that followed the Beetle swarm, Providence was a town laid bare. The initial shock gave way to a gnawing, pervasive anxiety. Winter was coming. The root cellars were empty. The shelves that should have been groaning with jars of preserved beans, tomatoes, and corn were bare. All eyes turned to Eliza's farm. They came, not as a mob led by Gable, but as individuals and families, their pride swallowed by a more fundamental need. They came to her gate, their gazes a mixture of shame and desperate hope. They remembered their mockery, and the memory was a bitter taste in their mouths. Eliza met them not with recrimination, but with business. She set up a small table by her gate, with Leo at her side. A basket of cabbages, a crate of squash, and a dozen eggs were placed on display, with prices written on a small slate. The prices were fair. They were the same prices she had seen at the market in the city before the swarm. They were not the gouging, opportunistic prices of a monopolist, which is what she had become. She could have named any price. She could have demanded gold for a head of lettuce. She could have bartered for land, for livestock, for anything she wanted. Mr. Gable would have. But Eliza's arithmetic was different. She was not calculating profit. She was calculating survival, the town's, and her own place within it. The first to approach was Silas Croft. He shuffled to the table, his hat in his hands, his eyes on the ground. "Miss Vance," he mumbled, "I reckon I need a few of them cabbages. And some eggs. My wife, she sets a store by her egg lemon pie." He looked up, his face a miserable portrait of humility. "I was wrong about you. About the birds. I was a fool. The price is on the slate, Mr. Croft," Eliza said gently. He fumbled in his pocket and produced the coins. She gave him his food. He took it and walked away, his shoulders a little less slumped. He had not been given a handout. He had been a customer. He had retained a sliver of his dignity. One by one they came. She sold her produce for cash to those who had it. For those who didn't, she created a different kind of currency. "Mrs. Miller," she said to a young widow with 3 small children, "your husband was a fine carpenter. I have a roof that needs mending before the snow flies. A week's worth of food for a week's worth of work." The woman's eyes filled with tears of relief. She would not be a charity case. She would be a tradeswoman. Eliza traded vegetables for mending, for firewood cutting, for the loan of a strong horse. She was not just feeding the town. She was rebuilding its economy, one small, fair transaction at a time. The one person who did not come was Martha Gable. Eliza would see her sometimes, a pale figure in the window of her large, prosperous house, a house whose larder was now as empty as everyone else's. Pride, Eliza knew, could be a more powerful force than hunger. Then, one evening, as dusk was settling, a small figure appeared at the gate. It was Leo's younger brother, carrying a large, cloth-wrapped bundle. He wouldn't meet Eliza's eye. "Ma sent this," he muttered, shoving the bundle at her and turning to run. Eliza unwrapped it. Inside was a magnificent, hand-stitched quilt, a masterpiece of 1,000 tiny, perfect stitches. Tucked into its folds was a note, written in a shaky hand. "For the boy. He looks thin." It was not an apology, but it was a beginning. It was the currency of a proud woman who had nothing else to trade. Mr. Gable's power in the town had been built on the perception of his success. His big house, his fine horses, his booming voice, they were all symbols of a prosperity that others sought to emulate. But the Beetle swarm had exposed the fragility of that foundation. His wealth was in grain futures and land speculation, not in food. He couldn't need his ledgers. As Eliza's garden became the de facto center of the town's economy, Gable's influence waned. He tried to rally the men, to incite them to action against the hoarder at the edge of town, but their bellies were full of her food, and their days were full of the work she provided. They were no longer listening to him. His final, desperate move was to try and replicate her success. He sent a man all the way to the city to buy quail. 2 weeks later, a crate of 50 terrified, half-grown birds arrived in Providence. Gable had a pen built, a slapdash affair of chicken wire and raw lumber, and set his new flock loose in his ruined garden. It was a disaster. The birds, stressed and disoriented, refused to eat. They huddled in a terrified mass in one corner or flew against the wire, seeking escape. They were not tame, content workers like Eliza's flock. They were wild, frightened creatures, and within a week, half of them were dead from stress and injury. The failure was public and humiliating. It was the final nail in the coffin of his authority. He became a ghost in his own town, a man whose pronouncements were met with silence, whose advice was no longer sought. The town had found a new center of gravity. It was not a man in a big house, but a woman in a small shack. It was not a voice that boomed, but one that spoke quietly of fair prices and honest work. The community that formed around Eliza's farm that autumn was stronger than the one that had existed before. It was a community forged in shared hardship and mutual reliance. The men who cut her firewood felt a sense of ownership in the warmth of her house. The woman who mended her roof looked at it with pride every time she passed. Leo was no longer seen as Gable's strange, quiet son. He was Leo, the quail master, the one who knew the bird's secrets. Boys who had once thrown rocks at his heels now came to him with questions, their pockets full of beetles and worms as offerings for the flock. He taught them the names of the birds, and in doing so, he taught them a new kind of respect for the small, living things of the world. One cool October evening, Mr. Sorensen came to visit. He sat with Eliza on her small porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and curing onions. Her cellar, once a nursery of hope, was now filled to bursting with the real, tangible bounty of her harvest. It was full, and so were the cellars of half the town, stocked with food bought or bartered from her garden. The land speaks a new language to the valley now, Sorensen said, his voice a quiet rumble. Not the language of shouting, but the language of listening. He looked at her, his weathered face softened by the twilight. You are a good listener, Eliza Vance. Eliza looked out at her garden, at the netted enclosure where the quail were settling for the night, their soft calls a gentle chorus. She thought of the silence that had greeted her, the mockery, the loneliness. It all felt a world away. She was not a woman alone anymore. She was the heart of a town she had inadvertently saved, not through a miracle, but through the stubborn, patient application of work and belief. I had good teachers, she said, thinking of him and of the birds. Winter came, and it was hard, but it was not the catastrophe Mr. Gable had predicted. The town, leaner and more resourceful, survived. They survived on Eliza's squash and cabbages, on the small, rich eggs her quail continued to lay through the cold months, and on the new currency of mutual aid. The quilt from Martha Gable lay on Leo's bed, a silent treaty between two households. Mr. Gable remained a recluse, his bitterness a cold fire that warmed no one, least of all himself. When spring returned, it was to a different valley. The farmers did not just plow their fields. They came to Eliza, hats in hand, to ask her advice. They wanted to know about stone walls and netting. They wanted to buy quail chicks, which she and Leo were now hatching in a steady, managed supply. She sold them the chicks, and with them, the knowledge of how to care for them. She did not give it away, but she did not hoard it either. She taught them the arithmetic of survival, the patient language of the land. That spring, a dozen smaller versions of her garden appeared throughout the valley, each with its own small flock of quail, its own netted enclosure. The town was not just rebuilding, it was evolving. They were learning to see the value in the small, the overlooked, the thing they had once dismissed as worthless. Chef Antoine's weekly wagon continued its route, but it now stopped at 3, then 4, then 5 different farms, picking up crates of quail eggs. Eliza had not created a monopoly. She had created a new industry. One warm afternoon, as she and Leo were transplanting tomato seedlings into the rich, dark earth of the garden, a shadow fell over them. It was Mr. Gable. He looked older, smaller. The arrogance had been burned out of him, leaving behind something hollow and tired. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice raspy. He did not look at her, but at the soil. "My wife, Martha, she asks if you would be willing to sell her some of your tomato seedlings. The special ones. The ones the beetles don't seem to like." He was asking, not demanding. It was the first time she had ever heard him truly ask for anything. Eliza straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at Leo, who was watching Gable with a neutral, unreadable expression. This was a moment of decision. She could have refused. She could have savored the victory. Instead, she walked to a tray of her strongest seedlings. "These are the determinator variety," she said, her voice purely practical. "They are reliable. You have to plant them deep and give them support. Leo can show you." She handed the tray not to Gable, but to his son. "Leo, why don't you walk over with your father and show him where the sun is best in their yard?" Leo looked at her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He nodded. He took the tray and turned to his father. "This way," he said, his voice quiet but clear. As Eliza watched the two of them walk away, the tall, stooped man and the straight-backed boy carrying the future in his hands, she felt a profound sense of peace. Her vindication was not in Gable's defeat, but in this small, quiet act of reconstruction. It was in the land, healed and thriving. It was in the town, fed and reconciled. It was in the boy, who had found his purpose. She turned back to her work, her hands sinking into the warm, living earth. The air was filled with the gentle, burbling calls of the quail, the sound that had become the valley's new anthem, a song of patience, resilience, and the quiet, unassailable power of listening to the land.